In July 1892 in the Ethiopian province called Harar, a baby boy was born, the son of the royal governor of that region called Ras Markanin. Markanin, who was a cousin of Emperor Menelik II, the ruler during this time, named his new son Tafari, meaning one who is to be respected. This has also been interpreted to mean prince. His mother, who died during his infancy, was of mixed, non-royal heritage with a Muslim father, something that could have been problematic for the young prince, had his place in the line of ascension to the throne been more prominent during his youngest days. Ethiopia, or Abyssinia as it was known during those days, had had a long Orthodox Christian history stretching back to the year 330 CE during the time of Izana, the king of Aksum. The form of Christianity that had been introduced into Ethiopia had been in one of its earliest incarnations, free from the influences that would within a short time be introduced into the religion from the Roman authorities under Constantine, the Caesar of those days. Before various religious books were compiled in Byzantine Rome to make up what would become the Holy Bible. Although it would take its authority from the Coptic Church in Egypt, it would also develop their faith to carry many unique characteristics that would relate to their own history and culture, giving the Ethiopian Church an individual identity, frowned upon by Christian Rome and various other European powers that it would encounter through the centuries into the present times. Perhaps the most significant divergence from the westernized Christian idea is its focus on the story of the Queen of Sheba, who is claimed to have been a queen in their land in ancient times, who came back from a visit to the Holy Land across the Red Sea in the east with a son, after a brief relationship with King Solomon of the Bible story. This son, his name King Menelik, would be recognized as being the ancestor of the present royal family, to confirm a direct connection between the crowned ruler of Abyssinia and the nominated royalty of the chosen people of God in the Bible. The early development of the Christian faith in that land is also credited with playing a significant part in the introduction of the Muslim faith during the 7th century in Arabia. Within a few years of the birth of the young Tafari Markanin, Italy had launched into its war with the Ethiopian Empire, hoping to carry out its aim of claiming the territory as a colony during the era when the scramble for Africa was still seen as being a legitimate practice by the European countries. This campaign would prove to be unsuccessful for the Italians, who were severely defeated at the decisive Battle of Adwa, recognized and celebrated as being the first defeat for a modern European army in a war against an African nation. Even before the war, Menelik II had recognized a need for his nation to modernize and to open up international trading relations, to be able to stand its ground in the New World era that had been forming around it whilst the nation had been in its centuries-old self-imposed isolation from the rest of the world. In agreement with this policy, Ras Markanin brought a tutor to teach French to the young prince and his cousin Haile Selassie, both aged around 10 years old. This would be in preparation for a time when they would be considered for high diplomatic posts in line with the running of the nation and international affairs in later life. Markanin would also hire an Ethiopian scholar and teacher called Abba Samuel Wold, who had been living at the French mission in Harar, to educate the two boys in the ways of international etiquette and spiritual well-being. Interestingly, it should be noted that Abba Samuel was a Catholic friar, his father having previously converted to that version of the faith and raising some suspicion amongst some members of the Ethiopian nobility that the young Tafari was being prepared to abandon his original faith. Such fears would be allayed when the young prince was baptized in the Orthodox Church, adopting the name of his virtual stepfather Haile Selassie, his uncle-in-law and the father of his cousin Imru. In true ancient African tradition, The name Selassie was also a nod to his paternal grandmother's ancestry, recognizing his own assumed Solomonic descendancy and his unwavering commitment towards the nation of his people and its God. This coming after his first appointment as governor, coming at the age of 13 years old, in a peaceful, easy-to-administer region, and the sudden death of his father in 1906. Tafari is said to have fathered his first child with his first wife during his mid-late teens before that marriage broke down, and he would eventually marry his second wife Menenus IV in 1911, not long after being made governor of Harar, replacing Emperor Menelik's loyal but ineffective military leader, Balcha Sappho, who was a hero of the Italy-Ethiopia War. Both he and his new wife were relatives of the teenage heir to the throne at that time, Ligiasu, who is said to have played some part in their getting together. He was Emperor Menelik's grandson as well as being Menen's young uncle. Emperor Menelik had become incapacitated after having a series of strokes that had begun in 1908, but his heir was still too young and immature to be given the responsibility of taking the crown and officially ruling the nation. So a regent was put in place to rule on behalf of Menelik until such time as when the young man would come of age. Ras Tesma, another close ally of the emperor and a war hero, found his position as regent hampered by the actions of Menelik's wife, Empress Tatu, who was determined that her influence over the governance of the empire would remain as it had been with Menelik when he was still fit and able on the throne. The regent would succumb to ill health in 1911, and Ieyasu demanded at still only 16 years old that he be made regent himself. Iyasu's father Ras Mikhael had been a close friend and ally of Emperor Menelik, but had also been a born Muslim who had converted to the Orthodox Christian faith to advance his political standing within the nation. With suspicious eyes already set on him, Iyasu's sympathetic stance towards the Muslim communities of Ethiopia, alongside his willingness to raid into the more traditionalist communities to capture slaves, put him at odds with the Ethiopian nobility and would see him denied the title of emperor even after the death of his grandfather in 1913. Being effectively an emperor without a crown, Iyasu continued to frustrate the Ethiopian nobility, preferring the company of the Muslim leaders within the territory and flirting with the idea of joining the Great War on the side of Germany and the Ottoman Empire to gain in return control of the British, French and Italian Somali colonies on the east coast. After accusations had been made against him stating that he had declared himself on the Quran to be a Muslim determined to lead a jihad against Christian Ethiopia in front of a delegation of Muslim leaders, moves were made to have him disqualified to rule, seeing him deposed from the throne, whilst also being excommunicated from the church, in 1916. His aunt Zudatu Menelik would be put in place as Empress of Ethiopia, and her cousin Rastafari Markanin would become heir to the throne and her regent, giving him a significant level of authority to rule in a limited capacity under the watchful eye of the Empress. Following the diplomatic instincts that he had developed through his schooling, Rastafari began to follow a policy of cautious modernization for the nation and managed to secure membership of the League of Nations in 1923 for Ethiopia, promising that he would do all he could to rid the country of slavery. The following year he took a party of Ethiopian delegates on a European tour to promote possible foreign trade opportunities, visiting many different countries, with Italy the most obvious omission from the schedule. During their visit to Britain, the imperial crown of Emperor Tewodros II, which was looted along with other treasures during the British 1868 expedition to Abyssinia to rescue hostages being held by the beleaguered emperor, was returned to the exotic entourage in appreciation for a gift of 2 lions. Tafari's growing popularity amongst the progressives and nobles of Ethiopia over the following years led to increasing calls for his position to be elevated to hold a greater amount of parity with that of the Empress. But he also had some opposition, most notably coming from Balcha Sappho, who he had replaced as governor of Harar in 1911 and who had remained firmly dedicated to the legacy and memory of Emperor Menelik. The position of Rastafari, so close to the throne and with so much influence, for him denigrated the legacy of Menelik, and he began gathering his troops together and threatening to depose the crown prince to allow the empress to rule alone in 1928. Using slippery and deceptive tactics, Tafari was able to catch the rebel leader on his blind side, disarming him of his troops and forcing him to surrender. The clamor for Rastafari to be elevated in his position in relation to the throne would continue and the empress would be forced to concede, crowning him Negus, King, Tafari in the same year. Now as Negus, Tafari was able to carry out actions without scrutiny from the empress, which did not sit well with many in powerful positions, not least amongst them Razgugsa Wale, the husband of Empress Zuditu, who himself harbored a desire to be made emperor as the husband of the empress. Garnering the support of a few leaders within the empire, Razgugsa led an army of 35,000 in open revolt against Negus Tafari in early 1930. Despite much smaller numbers on the side of the king, they also had cannons, as well as aircraft which were used in one of the earliest examples of air warfare. Razgugsa would be killed in the battle and his army quickly disintegrated on hearing the news. Within days of his death the empress herself would also die officially because of diabetes-related illness, but questions as to what could have been the real cause remain. By the end of the year Negus Tafari would be crowned Haile Selassie I, Emperor of Ethiopia. In the months leading up to his coronation there was a buzz of excitement worldwide and the black communities both home and abroad were not immune. Marcus Garvey, a popular Pan-Africanist leader from Jamaica, somewhat caught up in the wave of suspense and fascination surrounding the occasion, wrote a play undoubtedly inspired by the pending major event in African history titled Coronation of an African King. It is very likely that the legend within Rastafari doctrine stating that Marcus Garvey prophesied saying that black people should look to Africa for the crowning of a great black king, were words spoken within the script of this play, probably by the narrator. The play was performed at the Liberty Hall in Kingston in August 1930, in a Jamaica still under British control and just a few months before the coronation in Ethiopia. In recognition of the suppressive methods used by the British colonial authorities against those they viewed as being too high and proud for their own good, some of Garvey's most loyal followers began taking those sayings as being coded words of prophecy from the man many called the Black Moses. So, the ideology of Rastafari would begin, with a focus towards Haile Selassie, the King of Kings, from a lineage coming down from the root of King David of the Bible story, a radical movement of the black spirit being developed by a few amongst the many descendants of slaves on that island of Jamaica, who were still to the greater extent being forced to live as a downtrodden underclass. As Crown Prince, Haile Selassie had entered a treaty with Italy in 1928, relating to its border with Italy's Somali colony on the east coast, but in 1930 Italy built a fort on the border which encroached into Ethiopian territory. Having ignored all appeals for the Italians to make the desired corrections with regards to this infringement of the treaty, the colonizers then began to go on the offensive, spreading false propaganda across Europe against Haile Selassie in the hope that they would gain a free hand to carry out Mussolini's ultimate plan, the annexation of Ethiopia. They had alleged with no base in fact, that Haile Selassie had been gathering a massive army of black soldiers from across the globe, many of whom had been trained in European armies, to fight in a race war to overthrow all of the white powerful nations. Late in 1934, with the Italians still unwilling to retreat from Ethiopian territory, Some skirmishes would break out between the two sides, with the Italians holding their grounds whilst the Ethiopians sustained the greater number of losses. Haile Selassie would take his complaint to the League of Nations, but they would refuse to take any action against either side, describing the incident as being a minor misunderstanding. France and Britain both went into an agreement with Italy after this incident, hoping to at least secure their neutrality when it came to a possible future conflict with Germany, allowing Mussolini to feel free to carry out his invasion of Ethiopia, which he did in October 1935. The League of Nations would bring some sanctions against Italy for its actions against Ethiopia, but they would prove not to be effective as many of its member nations chose to ignore it. The invasion intensified until Haile Selassie was forced to go into exile en route to Britain in May 1936, and Mussolini wasted little time in sending his troops in to seize the capital, Addis Ababa. A group of black intellectuals based in England, Marcus Garvey amongst them, had gathered at Waterloo Station hoping to be able to get the attention of the Emperor on his arrival there, but their attempts were swiftly rebuffed. There can be little doubt that the false rumors going around in the newspapers across the world, surrounding Haile Selassie's secret army of black soldiers preparing for the ultimate race war against global colonial power, would have meant that the British would have been determined not to allow the group to get anywhere near the Emperor. The feeling amongst the group seems to have been that the Emperor should have done more to insist that the group be allowed to meet with him, which would have been quite impertinent of the Emperor, known for being a skilled diplomat, and perhaps even a suicidal step to take given his personal situation as a humble guest of the seemingly wavering British, being hopelessly exiled from his occupied homeland. Marcus Garvey's criticism of the Emperor would cause a split with some members of his UNIA organization in Jamaica who had begun to take on the Rastafari ideology, using Bible scriptures to qualify their new doctrine and using aspects of the negative Italian propaganda against Haile Selassie to hopefully bring the sweet aspects of the romantic lie to truth. In the following month, Haile Selassie delivered a passionate speech to the League of Nations in his native language of Amharic, complaining about Italy's invasion of Ethiopia, using chemical weapons to slaughter huge numbers of his people, whilst the member nations ignored international treaties and overlooked Italy's wrongdoings. Most of these nations would recognize Italy's claim to Ethiopia as a part of its Italian East African colony, only changing their position after Italy had joined the Second Great 20th Century War of Europe on the side of Nazi Germany, declaring war against Britain and France in 1940. There were only 6 nations that refused to acknowledge Italy's claim over Ethiopia in 1937, and Britain wasn't one of them. Amongst the 6 were the world powers of the United States, the Soviet Union and China. Haile Selassie would feel a lot freer to reach out to the African Americans who showed him so much support in his bid to regain his country during his exile, seeing the formation of the Ethiopian World Federation in New York City in 1937 to increase links between the oppressed black population of America and Ethiopia. With Mussolini now placed firmly by the side of Hitler, Britain moved swiftly to put a plan into motion to defeat Italy in Ethiopia, officially recognizing Haile Selassie as the Emperor of Ethiopia a month after Italy's declaration of war. Britain, France and Belgium all provided troops from its African and Caribbean colonies, and a number of African Americans would also volunteer themselves for the cause. The advance into Ethiopia would start at the beginning of January in 1941, and Haile Selassie would join them within weeks, setting his feet back on Ethiopian soil once again. Selassie would finally march triumphantly back into Addis Ababa in May of the same year. He was said to have been particularly impressed with the efforts of the dreadlocked Kenyan soldiers who proved themselves to be fearless fighters on the front line, achieving many successes against the enemy who Selassie gave the poetic tag of the dragon. The emperor set about continuing his program of modernization and social development, confirming in law the abolishment of slavery within the empire, which was enforced by the Italians during their occupation. He also began steps into what would become a near 2-decade-long struggle to break the Ethiopian Orthodox Church out from underneath the wing of the Coptic Church in Egypt and its Pope. After the Second Great War of Europe had come to an end, Haile Selassie brought his empire into the newly formed United Nations as a charter member, established out of the ashes of the failed League of Nations. Seeking to strengthen links with the African Americans, who were being forced to wrestle with the openly racist systems that still existed in America post-slavery, Haile Selassie set aside a large plot of land at a place called Shashamane where the black Americans could be supported to settle through a system of land grants to be administered through the Ethiopian World Federation in 1948. Word of this opportunity would spread over the following years, reaching into the Caribbean, and many would begin preparing to migrate to Africa in a place where they could at last be truly free. Ethiopia's neighboring nation of Eritrea, which had been under British administration after the end of the Second Italian-Ethiopia War in 1941, was joined through a UN resolution, as a semi-autonomous state, into the Ethiopian Empire late in 1950. Haile Selassie was a deeply religious and principled man, and much of his actions and decisions were driven by his devout belief in the spirit of the Christ Jesus, which for him centered around the sovereignty of his empire and unity with like-minded nations to be able to defend against the evils of fascism and racism. This ideology would drive him to send troops, perhaps misguidedly with hindsight, to participate in the Korean War in 1950–53 against the Soviet-backed North Korean contingent. With the smoldering Cold War situation that was developing, it is clear to see that after this, Ethiopia's military involvement on the international stage was curtailed, and with the cry for independence growing across the African nations, Haile Selassie's focus seems to gradually turn more towards Africa itself and its wider diaspora. The year of the Emperor's Silver Jubilee in 1955 would see the arrival of the first African Americans and West Indians under the EWF land grant scheme, as Haile Selassie also began moves to change the governmental structure of Ethiopian society with the intention of giving more power to the people. An attempted coup by the Imperial Guard against Haile Selassie and the slow pace of his reforms was carried out in December 1960, whilst he was away on a visit to Brazil, with his son the Crown Prince and heir to the throne Ama Selassie installed as emperor in his place, but this action would be crushed within days and the emperor would return with his position on the throne intact. Questions would persist around the actual part that the Crown Prince played in the rebel action, but Haile Selassie would refuse to take any further action against him after giving him a private rebuke. The northern Ethiopian region of Tigray would be struck by several years of famine from the late 50s, and Haile Selassie led calls for aid to be supplied to the region, both from across the empire and internationally, personally donating 2,000 tons of grain for the relief campaign for the famine that would finally come to an end in August 1961. In the following month, Ethiopia would officially take on a position of neutrality between the two squabbling blocs in world power, NATO, and the Warsaw Pact, becoming a member of the non-aligned movement. Selassie accepted an audience with a delegation from Jamaica who had been visiting various African countries investigating what the possibilities might be for people from the island to be repatriated to Africa should they so desire. Amongst the party was a small number of Rastafarians who put forward to him their ideas in relation to his personal divinity and their desire to rise above the crippling systems that had kept the descendants of slaves in Jamaica lost in a perpetual state of poverty and ignorance and return back to Africa, their natural home. The emperor would offer his support for their cause whilst rejecting the idea of him being a deity. In 1963, Haile Selassie played a focal part in the establishment of the Organization of African Unity, which formed just a portion of his ultimate dream, the creation of a United States of Africa capable of competing with the world powers of the United States, the Soviet Union and China. Later in that same year he made a speech to the UN representing the strong views of the OAU with respect to international peace and unity, against a background of the growing nuclear threat taking place across the globe. A segment from this speech would in later times be used in a popular reggae song by the world-famous Rastafarian singer Bob Marley titled War. From 1964, large numbers of Rastafarians from Jamaica would start to settle in Shashamane, taking advantage of the EWF land grant scheme, but in most cases arriving with no resources, skills, or the ability to make a relevant contribution to the advancement of the society. Haile Selassie would make a visit to the Caribbean in 1966, hoping to be able to address this as well as the continued deification by the Rastafarians of himself and of his title as the Emperor of Ethiopia. When his plane landed at Kingston Airport, Haile Selassie was shocked to see the thousands of everyday Jamaican people who had swarmed the airport hoping to catch sight of the man the Rastafarians were calling their God and King, the Holy Messiah who had come back to free the black people from their past oppressors. Haile Selassie refused to leave the plane until he had seen one of the Rastas who had visited him in Ethiopia in 1961. When the Rastaman, a man called Mortimo Plana, arrived, Selassie told him again that he was not a god and that his people were mistaken to believe or pretend to believe this to be the case. Plana reassured the emperor that the people would remain calm and respectful for his majesty, and taking him at his word, Selassie agreed to face the crowd, led down the steps of the plane by the Rastaman Mortimo Plana. During the following years, Haile Selassie would concentrate more on foreign affairs, leaving matters at home to be dealt with by his prime minister, leaving him distracted when it came to issues such as the Eritrean rebellion against Ethiopian rule and the famine in the Wollo region. A news report for the ITV documentary series This Week in 1973 brought news of the famine to the world, overestimating the death toll, and laying the blame for what was a common occurrence in that region, though on this occasion extreme in its impact, squarely at the door of the emperor, with claims that he had been too busy entertaining foreign guests and the nobles of the land to deal with the situation. Fueled by the news report, discontentment would continue to rise within the nation, particularly amongst students and the newly educated middle class who were beginning to lean politically towards communism, and in 1974 Haile Selassie was finally dethroned and imprisoned by a military grouping that had formed out of the widespread civil unrest against the emperor and his fractured government. The ITV producers of the original documentary about the famine would make a further documentary in the following year, backtracking on some of the things that they had said about the emperor, realizing that their claims had been used in propaganda to support a Marxist-backed uprising. But there was to be no turning back, as the damage had already been done. When news of the emperor's death was finally released to the world in August 1975, many of the Rastafarians in Jamaica refused to believe it, saying that it was just propaganda, holding on to a belief that the prophecy as they had interpreted it from the Book of Revelations in the Bible, had still yet to be fulfilled. Some would even dismiss the finding of his remains on palace grounds after the Marxist regime that had been in power was toppled in 1991, but after 50 years, Much like the man Christ known as Jesus in the Christian Holy Bible, Selassie is still yet to make a return in physical form to redeem all black people, as it was once believed by many that he would.